Louis smiled. Spike wagged his stubby little tail, and Mr. and Mrs. Musser winked at each other. They didn't care how Louis did it. They wanted that trophy, and they wanted it bad. They had all the money in the world, but they didn't have a dog show trophy on the mantel. "Something is happening," Principal Grimble announced tersely. He could barely catch his breath. No one in the crowd dared move a muscle. All eyes were focused on the little boy and his amazing dog, who stood as still as a statue, staring at the cats as if his life depended on it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is turning out to be the dog show of the decade. No, the century." Thomas held his breath. He had heard the expression, "time stood still," but had never actually experienced the phenomenon until this very moment. McGrowl found himself in a massive state of utter confusion. To win or not to win, that was the question. Whether to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, go for the cats, lose the race, and hate himself in the morning. He inched forward. Or win the race, lose the cats, and also hate himself in the morning. He inched backward. Didn't winning the race mean more to Thomas than anything? True, very true. Good dog. Forget the cats. Win the race. No, go for the cats. Lose the race. Yes, yes. McGrowl had such a headache he ceased thinking altogether and considered going to sleep. In another second it would all be over. Second place isn't that bad, Thomas thought. McGrowl heard and was too ashamed to reply. He couldn't bear disappointing Thomas yet again. He started running. The crowd held their collective breath. Was the dog winding up for an even more amazing feat, or was he simply giving up and running away as fast as he could? Mr. Wiggins no longer hugged Mrs. Wiggins. He wrapped his arms around himself and seemed to be moaning. Was McGrowl deserting the field? McGrowl ran up and down the front row faster than a speeding bullet. He growled and grimaced, and he threatened with lightning speed, and he was back on the platform and ready to continue with his spectacular performance before anyone but Thomas had noticed what was happening. 46 terrified cats were speeding out of the stadium, and Louis Musser was beginning to cry. He blew his nose loudly and pretended he'd gotten dust in his eyes. McGrowl could see a tear streaming down his face and felt bad, but just for a second. McGrowl finished his routine with breathtaking series of rollovers and scissor kicks that made even Thomas gasp with delight. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Mr. Wiggins jumped into the air and nearly fell off the platform. Louis Musser and Spike were so mortified they pulled their matching sweaters over their heads and tried to look invisible. Thomas and McGrowl sailed through the rest of their routine with the skill and grace of a pair of championship figure skaters. No child and his companion had ever completed the challenge with such an aplomb. At one point, the dog executed a hairpin maneuver on the tip of one paw, the doggy equivalent of a wheelie, and the crowd let out an ecstatic roar. McGrowl was in his groove. McGrowl did a series of flips and cartwheels while catching and returning the frisbee all by himself. Thomas stood by proudly, waving and bowing. Principal Grimble jumped up and down with such abandon he nearly twisted his knee. Miss Thompson forgot what she was doing and threw a batch of uncorrected midterms up into the air. And then it was over. The crowd was screaming. Principal Grimble's bullhorn was screeching and confetti filled the air. Thomas and McGrowl looked at each other so calmly and peacefully they might as well have been at home alone in their room. Thomas let McGrowl know that he was bursting with pride. McGrowl let Thomas know that he was happier at that moment than he had ever been in his life. Thomas was so excited he barely noticed the trophy being handed to him. Suddenly everyone was shaking his hand and congratulating him. Mr. Wiggins had to pull the car around and take every single thing out of the trunk to make room for the beloved shining silver award. McGrowl ran up and down and received more pats from more people than he believed possible. The crowd had given the boy and the dog a standing ovation that lasted more than 7 minutes and caused the principal to announce a school holiday for the following day. "Tomorrow will be declared McGrowl Day," he proudly asserted, "and we shall all spend it at home with our dogs. And those of us who don't have dogs," he paused meaningfully, "we'll just have to get one. I suggest the shelter around the corner." McGrowl was a hero, and Thomas was a winner. Mrs. Wiggins held her arms out and embraced Thomas and Violet, and then McGrowl. She didn't even notice the fact that they were extremely dirty, at least for 3 or 4 seconds. "What happened to you?" she exclaimed loudly, and quickly brushed herself off. Violet opened her mouth to speak. "You'll never believe—" Thomas interrupted. "While we were working on our science project," he began, and then he proceeded to tell the part where they came upon some arrowheads. He decided to leave the part out about the free-falling almost 100 feet down a tunnel in order to find them. He left out a couple of other things too, like the snakes and the lack of oxygen, and being trapped underground without any lights. He also failed to mention the fiendish electromagnetic device and Muchnick's secret boyhood hideaway. If she knew even 1/10 of what they had been through, neither one of them would ever be able to leave the house for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Wiggins was already sufficiently hysterical over the condition of their clothing. "Never," she said in her most serious tone of voice, "have I witnessed such an accumulation of stubborn stains and greasy build-up." And then they were in the car heading for home. Perfect strangers came out of their houses to cheer and wave. Thomas and McGraw were invited to appear on Simply Cedar, the popular local talk show. Even Flinty McFlint's radio show hour dedicated most of its program that night to Thomas and his wonderful dog,